All right.
All right.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to finish up the chapters of the book today and tomorrow, or today and Wednesday, sorry. And let me see, it's not letting me share my screen here, so give me just 1 second.
Oh, okay. I thought I'd set that, but
Quite all right. So getting into, of course, there are more chapters to the book, but kind of in the end of Unit 3, we're talking about, kind of skip over the crop sections. I think those are good for reference, but they don't really go into great detail on any crop. So I think you all did most of that through your crop project. So today we're going to talk about just general considerations for crop production, as well as harvest, post-harvest considerations, and marketing. So you grow a crop, and then what do you do with it? So, and also I should say that this will be our last quiz, and because it is, I shortened it. Give you guys a little bit of a break here from last week. Anyway, when we talk about producing crops, again, we think of agriculture and agronomy as, in particular, agronomy as kind of being based on those commodity field crops. And we can kind of look at a lot of the principles and practices for those commodity crops as being the same. But when we get into the less commodified crops, the less field grown, the more kind of variable crops, there's all kinds of the different considerations to look at. So I think, again, it's most important that you become an expert in the crops that you are growing. And if you are a livestock person, then those crops are, grasses, mostly looking at producing feed for your livestock. If you're a plant person, then that crop could really be any plant. So it all starts with a place and analyzing that place where you're going to grow the crops. And after that, you have to choose how you're going to grow those crops, whether it's going to be directly in the ground, field grown, or maybe greenhouse grown. In some cases, maybe you'll do a little bit of both. Then, of course, your harvest and preservation. So harvesting that marketable portion of the crop, and then being able to store it and preserve it until you can get it to the market. And then finally, how you get it to the market, how you transport it, and what are the systems that you use to actually turn that product into money. So for most of our commodity crops, again, these principles are somewhat similar. Generally, I mean, if we think about, say, wheat or soy or corn, we're growing these on a field level in large acreage, and the choosing of the production and growing system is really dependent on the variety of what it is that you're growing and how you deal with the pests that are associated with it. So there aren't a tremendous amount of different choices there. That's why the formula is somewhat similar for most of our commodities. When it comes to harvest and preservation techniques, the middlemen kind of dictate what you do there. So usually it's mechanically harvested, and then often for grain crops, we're preserving them, in silos until we're loading them onto trains and transporting them to the next part of the marketing. So that's kind of what we look at for the commodity crops. But again, every other crop that you can think of, and it has all kinds of different intricacies associated with that crop. So it's important that you become an expert in the crop that you're producing. So we have to think about when we're analyzing our site and the space that we're going to be producing crops at, first, you're going to try to meet your immediate demand, and that's going to be dictated by the market. But we also want to think about future expansion. So you might have a large farm, but you don't necessarily want to think immediately about using every acre. So think about how you might expand and maybe become vertically integrated. And that's one of the trends that we see a lot these days with producers, and not just a solo producer, but also in cooperatives. Um, People are sharing equipment, trying to make ways to make it more profitable for a group of producers rather than just one person. So um, when you think about future expansion, don't necessarily just think about growing more cropping area, but maybe including processing and storage facilities on site as you grow to become an employer and um, have people work for you. Thinking of places for them to go to, maybe for their breaks, places for them to use the bathroom, but also maintain sanitation. We also might look at the rural urban interface and that as an ability to expand in the future. I don't know if you guys had any of this near you all, but one of the results of election day in our neck of the woods was Bristol, Virginia was approved for casino. And with that gambling being approved, there was an immediate jump overnight in taxes and land prices assessments because they expect that the land value will increase. And that rural urban interface there, right outside of, which I mean, you get right outside of the city limits in Bristol, and you're in, farmland pretty much. That's going to affect the ability for farmers to potentially expand there, but also really to remain farming in some cases because they're going to have to pay more in taxes. So that's a consideration as well.
Yeah, we actually, they actually voted a casino in Danville, which is close to where I live, but it's actually in the city. So hopefully the county won't have much tax issue.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see that how land changes and the zoning associated with land changes. I mean, they are starting to kind of look at annexing more land from the city as well. And as housing developments move more into the county, it's I think the future is in your all's hands, really. I mean, we kind of dictate what that land is going to look like, whether we're going to see more housing developments or more farmland. So one of the biggest issues in site analysis is, of course, one of the primary inputs for your crop, and that's good water. We don't want to just have good quality water, but also have enough water. So, I mean, we think about that as gauging it from natural precipitation patterns, but also the ability to use surface or subsurface or municipal sources of water. And I really kind of shy away there at the end from the municipal sources of water. Let me just mark through that just because while some people do require some municipal sources, it's usually not the best irrigation water. I mean, it's been treated to be drinking water, and it contains lots of chlorine and fluoride, which really in the long term aren't good for plants. And it costs money, right? It costs extra money. Of course, it costs money to pump water out of a well too, but either way, thinking about both the water quality and the water quantity that's available in your growing season. And if you're going to use irrigation, which most of our field crops, we don't use much irrigation for in the mid-Atlantic Atlantic because we generally have enough natural precipitation. But if you're using irrigation, then the type of irrigation system has to be kind of matched up with the lay of the land and also what kind of water you're using. So along with that, we look at the physical features of the land, and topography being one of the most important. Ideally, more, I guess, flatter land is better for a wider range of crops, especially when you think about using a tractor on them, right, or using any kind of mechanical implement. We also want to think about proximity to things like rivers. Is it subject to flooding? And along with topography also comes the whole microclimate issue, where you have little areas of your farmland that might be warmer or cooler depending on kind of how air moves across the landscape, where it settles, where you have a cool air sink or warm air rising. And that's going to be mostly, we're going to see that more on more varied terrain. We see more microclimate situations, but nonetheless, it does play an important role in your site analysis. Soil type, of course, is also very important, but that's something that we really can't change that much. You can't change your soil type. You can make it better and you can amend it, but you really can't change the texture of the soil long term. You can add more organic matter to make it better. You can add fertilizer to add the nutrients, but we really can't change the texture of the soil. So that's very important. And I've talked to a number of farmers who have kind of moved to this area, that's one of the things that they looked at was what is the soil type and the place that they're going to be operating, especially if you're growing in ground. So also consider that there may be several different soil types in a single location, especially if you look at a larger acreage, which may need different growing strategies on those different soil types. Climate is another thing we really can't control. We think of needing enough sunlight, but we also need protection from heat in warmer regions, and protection from cold and drying winds, especially in the winter. We also want to look at the precipitation patterns. If we have drought periods or monsoon periods, as we do have in many parts of the country where agriculture is practiced. And for as many parts of the world, their growing season is kind of matched up sort of with the monsoon season when you get the most precipitation. But you have to be careful of that because, of course, flooding can be a major issue as well. Also, along with the climate, we think of the weather itself. So what is the potential for serious storms in your area? Hail especially, where is your prevailing wind direction? Snow and snow load can be a big issue if you have buildings and greenhouses especially. And also the possibility of extreme weather events like flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, the precipitation associated with hurricanes, extreme summer highs in temperature or very low winter lows. This all affects what you can grow. We also look at the economic and social factors, kind of like what we were just talking about with the casino issue, but we think of always the biggest initial expense as being the cost of land itself. And I always wish that I could go back in time and buy land here when it was extremely cheap. I mean, even when I was younger, land was fairly affordable here, but now, especially like in Washington County, Virginia, that land has just gotten to be so expensive that it's almost prohibitive for beginning farmers to get into agriculture unless you're given the land. And I will say too that something that I think that we probably need to work on is connecting willing farmers with land, because there's a lot of it out there, and there are lots of people that want to see the work that they put into their land and making it better, improving it. They want to see that continue. So in some cases, there are people that are willing to just give you a lifetime lease for very cheap or maybe even free. So um, you know, learn to look for those opportunities. Um, Again, I wish I could go back in time, because there was land in the family that eventually got subdivided and turned into a housing development because nobody wanted to farm it. Also, we had a local landowner come to the college wanting to donate 300 acres if we, were willing to actually keep it in production, but we didn't have the manpower. So unfortunately, the foundation people said, no, we can't do anything with that land because we don't have the manpower. So anyway, I'm just saying that it is out there. I mean, there is a such thing as low cost and free land, even though the biggest initial expense is land costs. And second to that is labor. So we think of both the availability of good, reliable labor on the farm as being a major issue, but also the cost of that labor. And in general, labor accounts for a third of business costs, but it can easily be the largest cost too. So it kind of, it's a moving target, right? But um, finding good workers is difficult. And when you do find them, you want to try to keep them. So how can you, mesh that in with your, level of agriculture production to provide um, really a living wage to, workers so that they'll stay on your farm. The places intended to tour, and hopefully we'll still get that in. The Stewart Land and Cattle Company, one of the largest farms in the country, and the largest farm in Virginia, over 6,000 acres. Over here in Russell County, Virginia, is it's a pretty big operation, and they've had kind of tenant farmers live on that farm for generations. And that's, I mean, one of the ways that they're able to keep them there is that they have the families live there. They give them their own little plot of land. So nonetheless, something to think about. Along with that, your return on investment of any crop. But if we think about especially the perennial crops, a lot of these have to be grown for several years before you get any return on investment. A neighboring county, Grayson County, Virginia, its number one agriculture pursuit is Christmas trees. And I think that's a pretty good illustration of that. You grow a Christmas tree sometimes for 10 years before you can get it to size of selling. So what do you do, in that period that you're waiting to get money back? Often it involves loans, financing your operation until you get to the payback moment. That's a big economic and social factor. And some growers will grow kind of row crops in between perennials until the perennials are ready. So there are definitely ways to get creative with that. But sometimes it does involve a trip to the bank. Think about your your equipment and your product, moving it off site, but also moving those things onto your site. And if you are selling a product, how are you going to move that to the consumer? How do you get it to the market? So if we think about a lot of the commodity crops in the Midwest, again, a lot of these are kind of shipped by rail. um, they're put on trains and moved to large grain processors. Um, that's a benefit of, kind of the flatter land of the Midwest. A lot of people are trucking their products. So being closer to a major highway can be beneficial there. Um, being in the middle of nowhere certainly seems to have some advantages, but in terms of getting your product to a place, it costs more to move it there. Also, on the kind of employment side, you have to provide an easy for your employees to get to the farm, and also a place for them to park if they're driving there. And if we think about another trend that's happening a lot in agriculture, and that's kind of direct marketing, selling directly to the consumer, which is a way in some cases to get more of a return of the dollar that you've invested in your operation. But if you have a retail business, then you also have to have space for the sale of that product and also parking for your customers too. So, and really the operation needs to be located usually fairly close to an urban area or suburban area anyway, so that customers will come to you. Mm. Also, kind of on that, the opposite side there, if you're a wholesaler, then you need to be able to arrange for large trucks to come and go. All right, so let's look at some of the traditional production systems, or kind of what we refer to today as conventional crop production. And really, what we think of as this kind of conventional production system is somewhat industrialized at this point. And we look at a high level of inputs, mostly coming from fossil fuels, in terms of diesel fuel and synthetic fertilizers, pesticides. And there's a reason for that, and that's that in some ways there's a huge benefit of those inputs in that they greatly reduce labor and greatly increase the productivity. However, there are some hidden costs associated with that production system. We think about environmental impact, but I think even more than that, we think of just again the kind of the dollar amount as and the fluctuation of those costs. So if um, those costs rise and your bottom dollar, your bottom line is kind of based on a formula to where you have a fairly low margin that you're working with. We're only getting, say, 8 cents back on the dollar that we spend. Or I'm sorry, 8 cents on the dollar that is spent on food actually gets back in the hand of the farmer, right? So, or the pocket of the farmer. That's somewhat because this cost of these fossil fuels fluctuates so much, and it tends to increase rather than decrease kind of in the long term. So that's what I think is one of the biggest issues, is and how that affects the social construct of farming, really, the cost of the inputs themselves. So anyway, that's kind of what we think of as the conventional system, and that the value of that product, the crop product that you're producing, is determined by the inputs that you use. So just one example here that the book gives us is in fungicides, and how they could be used during the production of high value vegetable crops, but in kind of lower value grain production, they're cost prohibitive. Even though that could save your crop, to use that fungicide on a large scale is cost prohibitive. So it wasn't always that way, but now because of the cost of the fungicide, it is. Um, so I think what we were talking about last week, the integrated pest management, that really kind of has shifted the paradigm somewhat in kind of this conventional high input farming, to where it's somewhat more ecological now. Most farmers do practice integrated pest management now, whereas a few decades ago they really didn't. So looking from above at kind of a conventional system, again, we're thinking of large acreages, often monocultures. So kind of hard to tell from this picture, but let's just say that this is a soy farm or a soy patch here, and then we rotate that with a corn patch, right? So that's kind of part of that, and that is fairly traditional, I would say, where you would do some crop rotation just to preserve adequate nutrients and reduce your pest issues. So also one thing that we're looking at more, and from I think what they're mostly talking about in this image, is the preservation and the restoration and creation of wetlands being incorporated into more conventional production systems as well. What they say, it's kind of a funny thing that we call it organic, right? Those synthetic inputs were created, everything basically was organic. It's almost like, shouldn't that be kind of more the conventional? I will say though that the organic growing systems have gotten to the point where most of the organic farmers I know they're no longer doing USDA certification because it's so expensive to do it and prohibitive as well. So originally, organic was kind of a movement, a reaction to the Green Revolution and the use of these high cost synthetic inputs, saying, all right, well, let's do it kind of more of the traditional way. But now organic is really more of a premium pricing opportunity. And it's, it does make sense in some cases to get into organic production because you can sometimes get twice as much for the crop. It costs more money if it's something that is in demand, and if you're selling on a large scale. But again, some growers might use organic practices these days but don't become certified due to both the difficulty and expense, especially if you're direct marketing. Don't necessarily, if you can talk to your consumer and tell them your practices, then it's usually that's better, I think, than just being certified organic. So we talk about the concept of sustainability, which has popped up a few times, and the true definition of it is being able to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So I don't think of organic necessarily as being sustainable because of, again, the cost of inputs, of organic inputs sometimes is cost prohibitive. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily make sense either. So I think it's more important to kind of look at it from that guise of sustainability and being able to continue an operation. And we think of the three pillars, right? Not just what is often kind of pigeonholed there as the environmental aspect, which is important. You have to have the ecosystem in order to be able to even grow things. But beyond the environment aspect, we think about the economic and social pillars of sustainability. And that's kind of really what I want to try to ingrain in you all, is that it has to make sense from a money standpoint. You have to be able to to sustain it long term, by making, meeting the bottom line. So let's think of, something that might be considered a sustainable or organic growing system, which one of the oldest and most sustainable crop systems was slash and burn agriculture. Native Americans practice this. They say, anthropologists say, in a way that they would do slash and burn, clearing of forest land, and then they would produce crops just for a few years, and then they would leave that area fallow for decades. So it's like a 50-year crop rotation. Let the forest grow back, and then cut it down and burn it, and then grow there. And it's great land for a few years. But also, hey, the Native Americans weren't able to buy synthetic fertilizers either, right? So that doesn't make sense to do anymore, because we don't have enough arable land to do that. It also kind of caused a lot of environmental degradation, especially if we think about slash and burn agriculture being practiced on places that don't have naturally good soils, especially like rainforests. So just briefly give a plug for the USDA's branch that is known as SARE, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. And there's lots of great information from them, and lots of grants available too. So if you want to look into doing some research for sustainable production, a lot of times they'll help pay for it. So what they think of the primary goals of sustainable agriculture is, number one, providing a more profitable farm income, making it to where people do want to farm. Then they think about promoting environmental stewardship, and maybe let's just change that from environmental stewardship just to land stewardship, because really they are one and the same, but I think it's more simple and more relevant if you think about it as the land rather than just this esoteric idea of the environment. And if we think about it as the land, we think about the soil being part of it and how we have to protect and improve soil quality. We want to also think about reducing the dependence on non-renewable resources, and those include fossil fuels and synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. Not saying that these are a bad thing. I think that you need to use them, especially in the short term, but how can you get away from using them in the long term? So it's difficult, because the fuel thing, they say that 1 gallon of gasoline could be equivalent, if it's used efficiently, of up to 100 hours of human labor. So there, makes a lot of sense why we would use that. So what I'm saying here is that if we can use that fuel, especially when fuel prices are low, to make kind of long-term changes to the land, like for instance, maybe digging a pond, building a pond, or building earthworks that help to protect your soil and improve that soil quality. Those make sense in the long term, even though it might be a large short-term cost. The use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. Maybe you front load soils with some of those that are more easily, some of the nutrients that are more easily obtained through synthetic fertilizers, just so you can get your crops going. And then you transition to natural fertilizers or pesticides. Just giving you guys some fodder for thought here. Also, they look at minimizing adverse impacts on all the other stuff, which really is practicing integrated pest management. I think that's one of the main goals of doing that. And through all of that together, it promotes stable and prosperous farming communities. When we look at the scientific certification systems, the kind of the people that are, certifying sustainability or organic production, they look at these different 8 key elements. Being able to sustainably produce a crop. Again, that means being able to do it long term without degrading the land. Managing the ecosystems and protecting them. Conserving resources and energy. Integrating waste management, providing fair labor practices, community benefits, and product quality, safety, and purity. Those go into the of, I guess, certifying a farm as being sustainable. So we think of building and maintaining the healthy agro ecosystem as based on really the soil. Looking at using integrated pest management, really. So you're looking more at using the biological, mechanical, and cultural methods to control pests rather than the chemical methods. It's not the same that chemicals, but you try to minimize their use and use those that are kind of lower risk. And you're going to phase out those that pose risk to your people and the environment. So when we look at all of that, we look at kind of optimizing our environment to produce a crop sustainably, long term. Not just thinking about the short term growing of the crop, but how can we do it long term in a way that preserves the land. So we look at managing the soil, the water, the nutrients, because those are the environmental factors that go into producing your crop. And one of the major environmental factors for crop production to get photosynthesis, of course, is light. So how do we manipulate light? Really, there's not a great way to add light, especially if we're talking about growing in the field. You really can't do supplemental lighting. Let's bring in the LEDs, right? That doesn't really work in the field setting. So the only way we can really manipulate light is through row orientation and the spacing of plants. So to make sure that you're getting the most photosynthesis out of each plant. And also how that light penetrates your row spacing as the sun moves across the sky, which is going to vary with latitude and season. If you ever think about growing crops in the winter, then you might alter that row orientation or plant spacing based on that, if you're doing it as a row crop anyway. So always think about the light and really look at kind of the planes. Can water together with the nutrients in the soil are the main drivers of plant growth. So once we've grown the crop, we think about harvest, of course, and harvest being that final step of production. And that looks different for everything. This is in this image, that's not something you would really think about. People standing in water to harvest something, but in this case, for the cranberry harvest, they flood the fields completely so that they can harvest those cranberries. So there's different functions that are involved in harvesting different plant products, and they are highly dependent on what that product looks like. Is it a fruit? Is it a vegetable? Either way, while we're harvesting it, we have to take good care to maintain that product and avoid damage in a way that it might lose value. So most harvesting was originally done by hand, hand tools. And in many parts of the world, it still is. Our commodified crops are now all mechanically harvested. But when we think of all of our fresh market vegetables and fruit and even the flower crops, they are still picked by hand. We just haven't got to the point of really optimizing mechanical harvest for those things. Now there are like mechanical tomato harvesters, for instance, but in order to be able to do that, you have to have a determinate crop, because when they use these mechanical harvesters, it basically kills the plant. So you want all the fruit to be pretty much at that harvest stage at the same time. So they've started to kind of move towards mechanical harvesting of some fresh market crops. But most of the widest range of fresh market vegetables and fruit is still harvested by hand, which makes migrant labor being, still in existence and still so important, especially in fresh market production areas like Florida and Central Valley of California. So again, for our commodified crops, that harvesting has been mechanized, and we've engineered, it's incredible really to think about the ingenuity that has gone into creating these implements that allow for very efficient harvesting of things like pictured here, cotton. That all started though with cereal grains and like barley pictured here, using a combine to harvest and sort that as we're growing it, and also thresh it as well. So removing the harvestable portion of that plant from the rest of it, what we kind of consider the chaff. So this has greatly reduced human labor, which has greatly increased the kind of bottom line there in these commodity crops and their viability as a commodity crop as well. And it's great all around because we think of it as, you do need to run this equipment, but overall, kind of in the long term, it has kind of decreased the overall usage of that fuel. Now, that kind of seems counterintuitive, especially considering the book is saying that it has increased the need for that fuel in agriculture, but in the long term, I think as a total energy cost, it's actually reduced it. So anyway, generally mechanization is developed for those crops that are intended for processing rather than those that are going to the fresh market. So most of our fresh market stuff is limited because we haven't made, soft machinery, right? We haven't been able to create machines that are able to limit the injury to the crops. It's not delicate like we need, because these crops are delicate. Now there are some examples of those that are being created or have been created, like in the image here, this corn puller implement. It's a mechanical picker for sweet corn, so it removes the ear from the stalk without much injury. But in the case of sweet corn, it has that husk, so the natural biology of the plant limits it to a certain extent from loss due to harvest. And even with that, probably the majority of sweet corn is still picked by hand. There are mechanical harvesters here for like iceberg lettuce and some leaf lettuce. And I think there's more and more work into developing these that are kind of, smaller scale options for market gardeners and farmers. So there's more ingenuity taking place, and more of these mechanical harvesters are being developed. But in terms of the large scale stuff, most of our fresh market stuff, again, is still harvested by hand, and often by migrant labor. So, most of these workers in these images here are probably migrant workers. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're immigrants, but probably a lot of them are, and probably a good portion of them are illegal immigrants as well. So something else to think about, the social issues associated with that. Um, Here's an image of a machine that's basically stripping flower crops. So we're still harvesting, cutting them by hand, but then the machine aids in more efficiently stripping the leaves and trimming the stems, and in some cases even sorting the products as well. So in any situation where you're thinking about adding machinery to your harvest, you have to kind of look at that long term and scale. Can you scale it up enough to the point to where it would pay for itself? I think that's a reason why we see more and more like co-ops popping up, and some very successful co-ops. We have figured out how to digitize a lot of kind of harvesting aids, I should say. So using computers and electronic sensors to improve harvest efficiency, but also to kind of sort crops as well. We've been able to use GPS to field equipment and precisely control it as it moves through a field. You still have to have someone driving the tractor, but it's guided by GPS, which is pretty cool. There's more and more sensors are being created that can also help, such as yield sensors that will slow a harvester if the yield is so high that you're leaving grain in the field, and also moisture sensors that record the moisture content of grain as it's harvested, and will move over it if it's too moist, so you don't lose quality there. And also those sensors that sort the products by color or appearance. After we actually harvest that marketable portion of the crop, we've got to do something to preserve it until we can get it to the consumer. So this was a critical development really in human society, the ability to really store anything for a long period of time, and in a way that preserves it. And in some cases, I think this is another area where it can improve the bottom line of production if we figure out ways to preserve our products until we can sell them when demand is the highest. Even though we've been doing this for really thousands of years, our crop losses after harvest still remain unacceptably high. So we've been trying to, food scientists, agriculture producers have been trying to figure out ways to limit the post-harvest deterioration, which in turn, if we could, would make a major contribution to improving the world's food supply. So here's a table from the book that just looks at plant parts that are harvested at the stage of development, whether they're immature or mature, and what part is harvested. So there are lots of things that we don't necessarily let the crop get to, I guess, physiological maturity, to the point to where it's able to reproduce on its own. We're harvesting it before it gets there. So whether we're harvesting the whole plant or the leaves or the stems or even the fruits. So we think of like tomatoes, for instance, and they're saying here that, yeah, they are physiologically mature, but we're still harvesting tomatoes when they're not fully ripe, so that we can more easily pack them and ship them. So why does post-harvest deterioration occur? Well, there's a whole lot of reasons, and it kind of starts with the biology itself, which that can be physiological of the plants just after ripening. We think of the nutrient and vitamin content of plants being highest usually when they are harvested, but after they're harvested, some crops will continue to ripen. So, and that after ripening is just kind of biological deterioration in some ways. But that is accelerated by the presence of pests and pathogens. So we think of physical deterioration often beginning at harvest, but then biological deterioration kind of aiding in that. So when we separate that harvestable part of the plant from the part that is left there, the growing part of the plant, then we're really kind of wounding it in a way. We're damaging it and removing it from that plant. And even if we harvest that whole plant, in some ways we are damaging it. So in some cases, we will harvest by taking advantage of just that natural separation from the parent plant. And that will occur physiologically when the abscission zone that develops in the stems of fruit basically gets to the point to where it uses that abscisic acid, that hormone that we talked about earlier, to basically separate from that plant part. And I think a prime example of that is the musk melons or cantaloupes. If anybody ever grows those, you pick them when they naturally slip. So when that abscisic acid is, I guess, concentrated in that abscission zone, it just drops right off the plant at maturity. So there's lots of fruits and seeds that we take advantage of that kind of natural harvesting, but there are many cases when we don't have that. And we're about halfway through here. We'll stop for now, and we'll come back on Wednesday and finish discussing our harvest and post-harvest handling and marketing. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day and a great week.
Okay. Bye, everybody.